I want to just first of all have you look for a moment at, you can grab your little memory sheet beside you. Look for just a moment at Jeremiah chapter 6, or pull it up there beside you. You don't have to open your Bible to it, but there should be a little memory sheet beside you. And I encourage you to really to take those, and I know you may not be able to memorize every one every week, but what I do believe is you memorize some of them, get familiar with them, God will bring them to mind in the most important spots and times and places that you might not even know that you need it until it comes to you. So this is an important verse. Of course, all the Bible is important, but it's an important verse because, and it even ties in somewhat to the Daniel story. So I want you to just look at that verse, if you would, and all of it except the last phrase is on your memory sheet. I'm going to go ahead and share the last phrase with you too. It says, "This is what the Lord says, stand at the crossroads and look, ask for the ancient paths, ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not walk in it." Now, Jeremiah is a prophet that actually crossed over a little bit of time with Daniel. And he was at the end of his time when Daniel began his time as a prophet, and or his exile. Jeremiah was one who warned the Israelites that they were facing a time of judgment. And this is part of his message, and he's saying to them, stand at the crossroads and look and ask for the ancient paths. Now, what we're talking about today is learning from history. And we know that history has all kinds of information. It has information that you look at and you're going, man, we ought to do that. And then it has information where you look at it and go, oh, we should never do that. And so you see from history, you learn lessons from what people did right, and you learn lessons from what people did wrong. And so that's the importance of history. It gives us a sense of guiding our lives by being able to look back and see how things have been. The Bible itself actually has a ton of history in it, and so, you know, for some people that's a little boring. History can be a little boring. It can be a little bit like, what's that have to do with me today? Well, because people tend to be the same no matter what time period we've lived in, it has a lot to do with us today, a whole lot to do. In fact, you know, we're going to be reading about this king in chapter 5. We're switching kings now to a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and there's been a few different people who have served as king in the meantime, and we're down to this grandson. And things have declined quite a bit since Nebuchadnezzar was king. And one of the reasons it's declined is because these people refuse to learn the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned in the school of hard knocks. And he went through, he suffered, he obviously was a powerful man, as we've said before, the most powerful man on the face of the earth at that time. But in this period right here, these people, even though they knew about what all had happened, they knew he had gone out and lived like a wild animal and had lost his mind for a season of time. He had lost his kingdom, came back to him. They knew all of that, and they knew why he had lost it, and they knew why he had received it back, and they knew about him interacting with Daniel. They knew about him interacting with God, him having faith. I mean, they knew the story. But they didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, or at least enough attention to it. So follow with me as I go down through chapter 5. I'll stop a little bit as we go, then we'll come back to some notes. It says this, chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar, which this is the grandson. Now it's going to say King Nebuchadnezzar is his father, but it's a word that means ancestor. And most people from archaeology and everything else have kind of figured this guy to definitely be a grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. So King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, if you're familiar with the term sacrilegious, what they were doing at this point was very sacrilegious. They had taken what had been dedicated to God and for his purposes, had been placed in service and honor to him, and they had taken that and desecrated it and used it just for a common, really in this case, kind of a drunken banquet. And in the midst of using it, while they were using these cups, these utensils, all the things that were involved in this, while they were using it, they were offering up praise, not to the God it was dedicated to, but to inanimate objects, to the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They're offering this up. Now, here's what I'm going to say. A person can walk in ignorance and do a lot of things that are in opposition to God and his ways. But there is something about knowing the truth and then walking on that truth intentionally and then perverting the truth. And these were things, this was like a moment where this king, maybe it was from a drunken stupor, maybe it was from his, whatever was going on, but he decided this would be a good time to desecrate the God of Israel. And so he does this. And I just want to say that, we live in a pretty sacrilegious world. We live in a world that takes things that God has said are honorable and makes those things dishonorable. We live in a world that takes things that are dishonorable and says they're honorable. And so we live in a culture where there is a lot of flying in the face of God. There's a lot of things said, a lot of things written, a lot of things done, a lot of reactions to God and what God says. And it's taken and it's just literally either ignored or misused. And there are a lot of things done in the name of religion, even under the banner of Christianity, that has nothing to do with God. It has nothing to do with his purposes. In fact, it subverts the truth about God and who he is. So I need to tell you that even though most of us sitting here today would know not to take something that was honorable to God in the sense of we wouldn't, none of you would call up and say, hey, Rod, or, Kim, or whoever, we'd like to have a drinking fest or something like that, and we'd like to use the church for that. And by the way, we're going to, name off some other things that are, no one would do that. No one, I'm not saying no one would, but you guys would not nobody would do that. That would not be the case. But what can happen is that we can find ourselves sucked into a lot of ideology, a lot of philosophy, a lot of things that the world throws at us that is very dishonoring to God. And the scripture is clear that there are time periods, and that it's happened in cycles over all of history. You look back at the Israelites, it's happened to them, where they would dishonor God. We can look at this pagan nation, and we can really give it to them for dishonoring God here. But Israel, Daniel was even in this place because Israel had turned its back on God, had subverted God's ways, and gone their own way. And so it can happen to anybody, even God's people. It can happen to churches. It can happen to individuals. You can turn God's truth into something other than what it is and turn it into something where really, truthfully, you're totally dishonoring God than honoring him, with your life. It's refreshing to me to find somebody that I may interact with that actually, in talking to them, they admit that they're actually a sinner. They say, they don't pretend like what they're doing is right or good. They will even just say, I'm not a very good person. I'm because see, that's a person that Jesus said is going to get help. That's a bird. They know they're on the wrong track. But what we have today is a lot of people taking and saying, I'm going to say and do whatever I want to do, and I'm going to make it okay no matter what God says, period. And all that does is say, I'm God. I know more than God knows. I know more than the Bible knows. I know more than history can reveal. So this is a story back of, over 2,000 years ago that occurred, but it's reflective of a lot of attitudes and a lot of perspectives that we see in our culture today. And actually, this kind of battle has become much more pronounced in our culture than any time, in my lifetime, and I think in the history of the nation. So let's go to verse 5. Remember what had happened, what was going on. Verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall. Have you ever heard this statement? The writing's on the wall. You ever heard that statement? This is exactly where that statement. I don't care if you heard that statement in an ungodly place, someplace, or wherever else, or whatever. That statement comes from this passage right here. In fact, there are literally hundreds of statements that are used in culture, not as many of them today as used to be, that are born out of a statement in Scripture. When the handwriting, you say the handwriting on the wall, what does that mean to you? Pardon me? I'm hearing too many at once. Inevitable. Something is coming down. It's happened. It's going to happen. And it generally isn't good news, is it? Generally not good news. So here's the deal. It's like, it isn't good, but it's already done. It's a done deal. The handwriting's on the wall. Well, we know that because of the story. And most people even know what that means, even if they don't know the story. But it comes from a story. Let's go ahead. It says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Now, this is the king, person people look to and go, this is the guy in charge. This is the man in charge. And this hand is writing on the wall. The king's watching, and he goes just to mush. I mean, he literally goes to pieces. His legs gave out from under him. His knees were knocking. I mean, he is a mess. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck. And he'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Now, just to mention briefly, that third highest ruler is probably the highest position he could give, because there's a strong possibility that this king was serving along with his father and kind of like a vice king mode, but serving in this capacity in this area. And so that the next person in line would be the third highest in the kingdom. So it's the highest position he could actually offer to this person. So he tells them this. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, and this queen is not his wife, and his wives and his concubines were in there with him. This is probably his mother or someone from the line of Nebuchadnezzar down who was a queen in the kingdom. And she hearing the words of the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale." Have you ever had that situation where you remember when you were a kid and your mom started crying? Do the kids, whenever their mom starts crying, do they go, "Oh, mom's crying"? No, it upsets them. They want her to stop crying now. They want to fix it now. They want They may try to make her laugh. They may try to do anything, but they do not want their mom crying. That unsettles the kid if their mom's crying. Now, if their dad's crying, anyway, it's okay, men, to cry. We believe in crying, don't we, guys, here? We do. It's okay to cry. But it might shake your kid up a little bit, too, if you do cry, because their security is wrapped up in your confidence. Their security is wrapped up in your capabilities. And all of a sudden, if it seems like you're weak, it unsettles them. So everybody here is pretty unsettled as king. And so the king is, the queen is saying, look, it's going to be okay. Okay, we can handle this. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in the kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, grandfather truly, but your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. And so I want you to remember that, because we're going to talk a little bit about what made Daniel the wise person that he was. What made him so wise? That's what was it that came together for him? And so there's a lot of things said about him in those verses. And so she says, call for Daniel, and he'll tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and he's getting on up in years at this point. And the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Now, last night, as I was just reviewing the sermon briefly in our prayer time, I said to Brandon, I said, this is not something I'm going to because it's a later thought in the week, so it's not something I'm going to incorporate greatly into the message. But what strikes me here is that Daniel, who has this reputation for being able to do these things, if you look at all of Daniel, we're in chapter 5. How many times has Daniel been called in because they brought in everybody else and they couldn't do anything about it? And so they said, well, Daniel, at first time he had to offer his services, but after that they would go find him, they'd have him brought in and help him and have him interpret. And it struck me, I'm thinking, if I'd have been King Nebuchadnezzar, King Belshazzar, King whatever, and I knew we had someone like that in the kingdom, here's what I would have been thinking they would do. Wait until they got in a crisis, wait until they couldn't figure anything out, and then calling this guy. It seems like to me they just started the front of their week. Like whenever they sat down with their team on Monday or Tuesday morning, whatever it was, and they're gathering up and they're going, here, we're going to do this week. This is what we're going to do. This is the month plan. This is whatever. That you'd be having Daniel kind of sitting right there beside you, and as you're laying these plans out going, so what do you think, buddy? This guy, it's like they used him as a last-ditch effort, it seems like, in so many cases, and yet they knew he had the answers. Let me just ask you a question. How long does it take for you or me to seek help from God? Seek help from godly people. We'll go through a whole week, ignore God, ignore the Bible, ignore, and take attending church lightly, everything else, and be out there and then kind of run into walls and go, then at that point we're going, Lord, help me with this. Help me with this. You can help me, can't you? I'm just telling you, folks, the reason Daniel was so wise wasn't because he went to God in a crisis. It's because he walked with God every day. And he never took credit for the wisdom he always said, there's a God who reveals mysteries. In chapter 2, he said that. But I know a God who reveals mysteries. In other words, he didn't go, hey, I got this whole thing all wrapped up, man. Just talk to me. I can tell you. He knew the God who knew everything. And that was his connection. And these guys would only seek him out, it seems like, in moments, I mean, they'd put him in positions, and I'm sure he exercised a lot of wisdom, all that, but they'd only put him bring him in these tough cases. Nobody else can handle it. And I'm thinking, man, start off with Daniel. Start off with him. But it struck me, oftentimes we don't do that with God either. We don't start off with God. We go run and do this and do that and chase something, chase the other. Then we kind of bloody our nose a little bit, and we'll say, well, hey, I've talked to this person, I've talked to that person, I've talked to the other. Maybe I ought to pray about this. Maybe I ought to ask some people to pray with me about it. Maybe I ought to seek some godly wisdom. Wouldn't it be better if we started there? Wouldn't it be better if we would say, the God of eternity, the living God, He lives, if you're a believer, He lives within you. He wants to walk with you as you're going through your day. You don't have to have just a 10, 15, 20-minute, 30-minute devotion in the morning. It's good to have that, but you don't just have to have that. You can interact with God throughout the day. You can consult with Him. You feel like something didn't go right on the job, you weren't treated right, or you weren't sure if you treated somebody right. Consult with God. Consult with Him. And I've found this to be quite true. I've never heard God's voice, but I can tell you He's checked my spirit a whole lot of times, and that would be where I'm thinking, should I do this or should I do that? And I say, well, maybe I'll do this, and just almost as in the process of saying I'll do that, almost this check in my own spirit. You say, what is a check in a spirit? Well, I don't know. You have to walk in the Spirit to kind of know what that is. So just start walking with God, talking to Him. You'll know. You'll start recognizing when God checks your spirit, whenever you have this dis-ease about something. Now, sometimes you have to qualify that, because sometimes it's our emotions or things like that, and we have to make sure we're thinking well, that we've submitted well. But I can tell you, if you ask God, He will come through, and He'll guide you. He will do it. But so many times, I'm afraid we fail to ask Him, afraid to fail to go to Him. Just like these guys waiting till the last minute. All of a sudden, we're in deep trouble here. Let's get Daniel. Let's see what he can do. So verse 17. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. That's the first time that Daniel said that. Now, we're going to talk about Daniel's humility coming up, but let me just say this. I don't think Daniel said this just because he was being humble. Oh, no. You give that to somebody else. I don't think he was, because he always was willing to receive. Even in this case, he accepted the robe and the chain. You'll see in just a few moments. But what I think there were two things, in my opinion. This is my opinion. I can't prove it by Scripture, but my opinion is because he was getting up in years, probably around 80 at this time, or in that range. I didn't do exact math, but I know it's got to be close to there. He didn't have a whole lot more mountains he was needing to go out and climb. He wasn't looking for some new position. And I think the other thing was he knew this was not a good message. He was going to have to reveal to the king. And he did not want there to be any sense in which he was doing this for any motives other than to tell the king the truth. Now that's, again, my opinion on this, but I look at the context, everything else, I think at least there's a good chance that was the case. So he said, you can keep him, you can give the reward to somebody else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. O king, the Most High God gave your father. Now, I want you to listen to this, because this is a review of history that Daniel is giving right here. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor because of the high position he gave him. Now notice why Nebuchadnezzar was so great. God gave it to him. God placed him in that, okay? Daniel's not making any bones about that. Because of the high position he gave him, all the people and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. Now, I need to tell you, when Daniel was reciting this and telling this to these guys, he's not telling them this for the first time. In other words, this isn't the king's not sitting there and going, I never even knew that. That's amazing. Why didn't somebody tell that about my grandfather? These things had been conveyed. They had been told. They were a part of the history of a Babylonian empire. And yes, this king knew about these things. And you'll see it's very clear he did later on. Going on in verse 21, he was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. Now, you remember, Nebuchadnezzar came to that point when he came back to his kingdom after living as a wild animal. He sent the decree out, and he himself dedicated himself to this Most High God. He was truly a born-again person, a converted person at this time. And he acknowledged that God was the Most High. He is sovereign over the kingdom of men and over them, sets over them anyone he wishes. Verse 22, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. And hear those words? Though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple, from the God that your forefather bowed down and humbled himself before, this arrogant king, and God restored him to his kingdom. That king who honored the God of Israel, you went and desecrated that God. You got the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in your hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is what these words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign. It'd be one thing if he'd have said, numbered the days of your reign, and you have 15 more years. He didn't say that. And he said, brought it to an end. He's numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. I want to stop with those two words right there, first of all, because those are something that we need to pay attention to as well. Our days are numbered on this earth. And I'm going to trust God that nobody's final day is today in this place. But we know somebody's final day is today. And the truth is that each of us do have a final day. This king had not only not been preparing for this day, but he had been acting as though he was God, and he could figure out who they should worship, who they shouldn't worship. He could take the God that his forefather had gone out and lived like a wild animal and repented of his arrogance, and in that repentance, and placed God in his rightful place. And he went against that God and actually took things from the temple that were dedicated to that God, the only God, the true God, and desecrated them, was sacrilegious, went against even God. And so his days were numbered just because he was a human being, but they were specifically numbered in this case because he had hit the end. He had hit the final day. He brought himself to the final day at this point. And then also been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Now, I suspect that if God were to weigh us today, if we were to go around the room here, and God were to weigh us, I have a feeling at the end of the weighing of us, all of us would be found what? Wanting. Okay? would be found wanting. Nobody in here God would be going, well, you got it all right. You did everything just the perfect way. You're in. So we all know we would be found wanting. The truth is, that's a part of our human dilemma in a fallen world. But the good news is that the Most High God made sure that there was a way of redemption for us. And so he sent his only begotten Son to come into this world to die in our place so that we can have everlasting life and that we would not perish. And so God has made a way. And I want to ask everybody here today, do you know that you have received Christ and that you have asked his forgiveness? You have taken advantage of this great offer that God has made to us, so that because we can find ourselves in the same condition here, that we be found wanting. But the difference is this: when you turn to Christ and you're found wanting because you have chosen to honor God, not dishonor him, you've chosen to commit yourself to him and his ways, then through the righteousness of Christ, we are no longer wanting. We are covered by his righteousness. That doesn't give us a license to go do everything we want to do. God wants to develop righteousness. I think if you look at Daniel's life, this is a very careful life. He lived a very careful life. He lived a full-blown life. He had great responsibilities, but he lived a very careful life. He endeavored to do what was right before God. He didn't wait till a crisis. He didn't wait till he was in trouble. He didn't wait till something else. And I'm not going to steal, Brandon's going to be talking about the chapter 6 a couple weeks from today. And I don't want to steal his thunder on the Daniel and the lion's den. But what I want to tell you is this. One only thing that they could get against Daniel, the only thing they could get against him was his dedication to God. They could make a rule that violated his dedication to God. They knew they'd get him. Other than that, they couldn't get him. So this is a man who was good at what he did. His work was thorough. They could not catch an error in anything he did and use it against him. And so this man lived a careful life. And here's what I want to say. If you say, I'm an actor, we say, well, what film did you act in? Well, I didn't act in any film. I'm an actor. Well, we know you can act up, but we didn't know, anyway. That doesn't, saying you're an actor doesn't make you an actor. What makes you an actor is really acting. I know, we got some pretty burly guys in here, and if one of them walk up to you and say, hey, I'm part of the NFL. You say, well, what team are you on? Well, I'm not on a team. I just am part of the NFL. Well, if you can't give us a team and you can't give us your number, we're going to say you like the NFL, you wish you were part of it, but you're not really a part of it. A lot of people, and especially in an area like Georgia, say, oh, I'm a believer. I believe in Jesus. Here's the question. Does it show up in how you live? You say, well, we're not saved by our works. You're exactly right, we're saved by our works. But I'm going to tell you, if the God that I serve is as big as he is, he can't come into your life and not make a big difference. And unless you were already like part angel and part human, and you were so close to being, getting things right, and so you didn't have a change in your life, God's going to make a change. He's going to bring some change. There's going to be some things that you were doing before that you won't do. There's going to be some things that you start doing that you weren't doing, because he makes that kind of a change in you. I mentioned Drew, the younger Drew that we baptized recently. Some of you are aware. By the way, I just want to tell you, he's moved to Asheville with his job, and I want you to be praying for him, because he's new on his walk with the Lord, just a few months into it. But I believe Brandon and I are definitely still we're touching base every day through texting the Proverbs verses. If you're not doing Proverbs, if you got a great reading plan, you're reading through the Bible and you're already halfway through it, keep on going. But if you don't have a great reading plan and you're not doing that much with it, or if you have more time, read the Proverbs every day. What is today? 4. I already got 2 or 3 texts this morning from people who did their verses before they came to church, and so I want to encourage you, get in the Proverbs, ask somebody permission to text them your proverb of the day, and you text them back, and have them text you back their proverb of the day, and those of us that I know are doing it are having a great time, having a good time with it, And you can give a little explanation of your thoughts, or you just type, just send the, it takes all of about 15 seconds to copy and paste and send. And so get in on that if you can. But Daniel was a person who consistently followed a practice of being dedicated to a time with God. In fact, several times with God every day. And you'll hear more about that in a couple weeks. So let's go back to the last word here. Parson, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, in most cases, God doesn't give us that much insight ahead of time. But this guy was in deep trouble. Now, what historians will tell you, and the evidence from archaeology seems to indicate, is this, and that is that these guys, these two kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians, had come together and they were coming against the Babylonian kingdom. The kingdom had weakened. And as you can see, this king was more about partying than he was about ruling. He was more about getting everybody together, having a good time. He was more about, and not to say there's anything wrong with a good time, but the kinds of good time he was having was dishonoring to God. And he even did sacrilegious things in that. So basically, God is saying to him, your kingdom is going to be removed from you tonight, and you will die. And the Medes and the Persians, what they did, the city was very fortified, and so I think this king felt like they were pretty safe, even though the Medes and Persians were gathered around. It must have felt like they were pretty safe. He's going to throw a party with 1,000 people and come in, they all get drunk, and they all start doing crazy stuff. He must have either been very confident or very delusional. I'm thinking it might have been the last part, actually, as I read about this guy, a pretty weak-minded person, and the fear that he seemed to demonstrate. Verse 29, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Now, it is interesting to me, after this serious proclamation that was given about him and his kingdom, that he was at least a man of his word to follow through and do what he said he was going to do. He took the time to do that. But look at verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Here is, let me ask you, have you ever said the expression, man, I've had a bad day? Anybody ever said, I've had a bad day? Okay, most of you have. Most of you aren't going to admit it either. So, okay, I know most of you have had a bad day, or you've said you had a bad day or something else. Now, I'm going to tell you who had a bad day. Belshazzar had a really bad day. He starts off, woohoo, let's have a party, Let's do it, man. He call in the guys. Let's do this thing. Let's throw it out there. Get it all in here and let's do this thing. Let's have a great time. And they were all getting drunk. They were having a wonderful time in their minds. And man, did that party get crashed. And I need to tell you, God's not a party pooper, but I will tell you this. He will not be dishonored. And he is patient. And sometimes the patience he has with our world today amazes me. He is patient and he is merciful and he is kind and he is gracious and he is loving. But he is also a God of justice. And if you violate what he has set in place, we suffer the consequences of those decisions. It has even almost nothing to do with God's interaction, but we also set ourselves up for God's judgment to fall. And I just want to tell you two things. One is, next time you have a bad day, say, well, it was so far. If you're in bed already anyway, you feel like you made it safely there and nobody's breaking in your house at that moment, then say, at least it seems a little better than Belshazzar's ended. You can compare it to that and go, it's bad, but it's not that bad. But the other side of it is this. What a tragic thing to have so much influence and so much power and such a great opportunity, and to squander it away because you just go with your best idea. And that's exactly what this king did. He just, whatever he thought up, he thought that would be what he would do. He was just living on the hard work of his ancestors. He was living off of that, but he didn't learn the lessons from it. I would just like to ask you, we have these, when I was younger and I'd hear about these generational gaps, I would go, man, that's just stuff people make up. There's no generational gaps. But now I'm at the age that I am, and some of the millennials around me and they interact in my life, and then some of the ones other than that, I'm thinking, man, you guys are crazy. What is wrong with you? You know, you guys are nuts. Why do you think like that? Why do you act like that? Why do you do? You know, I like them and everything. I just think they're, you know, sometimes crazy. You know, but actually, there are a lot of really good ones. But I've noticed there is different kinds of thinking from generation to generation. And I you know, and I think that there's something about any of us. I mean, I can remember being in my 20s, and I can remember, you know, being in my 30s, and I can remember thinking, you know, man, you know, you just have life by the tail. Says, you know, not by the tail. I don't know, whatever you're supposed to have it by. But anyway, you just feel like life. You've got a hold of what it takes to make life happen, and it's good and it's great, and it is. But and you feel kind of invincible. And there's a little bit of a tendency, and I can remember me going through a time period, there's a little bit of a tendency to think that the people, generations before us, and kind of how they did a lot of things, whatever, just seem so outdated. I mean, you ever hear people say, hey, I mean, it's the 2000s. You know, you used to say, it's 80s. Like, now people go, I don't want anything to do with the 80s, you know, like, or maybe you like some music from there, maybe not. But, you know, we have this tendency to label this stuff and look at it. Well, I believe what we should do is take with us the things that are good from history. Take them with us. Now, there's always, you know, look at it carefully and analyze it and, you know, make sure it's a good thing. But take it with you. I mean, go back to the memory verse. Don't cast aside everything that was handed to you or that you brought you where you are. Honor that. Even if you change it somewhat, still honor it. This guy, he didn't learn from the mistakes his grandfather made. He didn't learn from the mistakes the other kings before him had made. He just continued on in an arrogant blast, which ultimately brought his downfall. Now, I want to ask, how do you become wise like Daniel? And I'm going to ask you to just follow through these quickly with me. Fill out your outline. Number one, never stop learning. I believe if you look at Daniel and his life, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these, if you look at Daniel and his life, he was a person who was always, he had knowledge. Here's what they said about him. He had knowledge. He had wisdom. And you have to have knowledge to have wisdom, but you have to use your knowledge properly to have wisdom too. He was a person, he was so impressive in those 3 years when he was a young man, so impressive that the king noticed, and he was like 10 times, he and his buddies were 10 times better at everything than the other guys around him. So he was a person who dedicated himself to learning what he needed to learn. And that. So never stop learning. If you want to be wise, you have to learn. I would just ask you this question. How long has it been? Don't raise your hand or don't holler out. You know, I know if it's yesterday, you're going to want to, okay? But how long has it been since you've read a book? I mean, I'm not talking about the Bible right now, but just read a good book. How long has it been? How long? See, there's other ways to learn than reading books and things like that. I mean, you can read Facebook, and I mean, there are articles on there, aren't there, or something like that. I mean, you can do, you know, there's ways you can learn. But here's the deal. The question is, what do you need to know? Are you willing to seek that out? Are you willing to pursue that? I believe Daniel was a person who was he was knowledgeable. And we know he dedicated himself to what he knew about God's law and consistently lived in that. And, you know, and I'm going to tell you, if you don't read any other book, please read this book. Please. Number two, learn the lessons history teaches me. And, you know, I know that, you know, we have enough people here who have had all kinds of backgrounds. You know, the movie that we have opportunity to watch and take some people to, please put that on your calendar and let's do that. What I would like to encourage you to do is, even if you had parents that were less than perfect, which all of them were, but if you had parents that actually were even kind of awful, I've watched people do one of two things. I've watched people repeat the mistakes of their parents because that's what they saw, and they just did what they saw, and it was bad for them when they were growing up, and it was bad for them as an adult. But I've seen other people who actually realized that wasn't a good way to do things, and they changed, but they still learned from history. They didn't repeat history, they learned from history, and they did it differently. See, sometimes people think, well, I have to do it just like they did it if I'm going to learn from history. No, learning from history is as much about not repeating bad things as it is looking at the things that really worked and building on that. So learn the lesson history teaches. If you notice, Daniel, who was in exile because of the way Israel had acted, seemed to have learned that lesson. He seemed to have learned that lesson. He was dedicated. God, I'm going to do things right. And if we were to go through the entire book of Daniel, you'd see one of his major emphasis was for Israel and Jerusalem to be rebuilt and to come back together. He had a passion for that. He did on his part what he could so that history would not repeat itself in a negative way, but there could be a new day for Jerusalem. Learn the lessons history teaches me. Number 3, maintain a humble attitude that honors God. It strikes me, here Daniel, he's the great problem solver. He's the guy who has the answers. Now, it seems like to me he would have gone to the best-selling circuit at that time, and he would have, billed himself as the wise guy with all the answers or something, and he'd go around book signings here and there and everywhere. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to write a book about success stories and things like that. It is. But Daniel, he wasn't about promoting himself. I'm going to tell you what his main role was in life, and he viewed it this way, was to promote God. That was and he wasn't obnoxious. He wasn't a jerk about it. In fact, he didn't even always bring it up. Oftentimes, it was brought out of him. It was brought out of him because he was such a dedicated person. Wouldn't it be so amazing that you live a life that's so dedicated that people just really want to come and receive what you have to offer? Daniel was like that. And it's because his humble attitude, he maintained a humble attitude that honored God throughout his whole life. Every time that he interpreted a dream, he never said, well, King, this one takes a pretty big mind, but I'm up to it. I'll do it. He never ever talked like that. He said, this doesn't have to do with me. This has to do with the God that I serve. Always honoring God. He never put himself down. Here's something else I noticed. This time is the only time that I can think of, at least in the scripture, where Daniel actually said, just keep the titles and everything else and give them to somebody else. Every time else, whenever he would interpret a dream, and they would say, I'm placing you in this position, Daniel accepted it. He didn't accept it like, well, I deserve that. He accepted it as what he viewed, I believe, as an opportunity for him to have a greater impact for God. And so he did. And he did a couple times ask for his buddies to be promoted as well. And so being humble doesn't mean that you don't achieve a lot. It doesn't mean that you're not successful. It just simply means that you have the right heart attitude toward God and toward people. Number 4, refuse to fill my mind with garbage. We live in a time period where garbage is not only at the dump. Garbage is everywhere. Everywhere. The internet is filled with garbage. The television is filled with garbage. The cable system is filled with garbage. I mean, there is garbage everywhere. I guess I would just like to challenge us to consider what we feed our mind. There's a lot of talk about, and it's all okay, about not polluting the earth. That's a good thing. God gave us responsibility to take care of it. There's a lot of talk these days about eating healthy so you don't pollute your body, and eating the right kind of things so you don't compromise your heart. It's not near the discussion about polluting your mind. And I'm going to tell you, your mind is one of the most precious things that God has given to us. And I'm just going to challenge you, if there's anything that you're polluting your mind with, anything, I start naming stuff, and we know pornography is one of the things that often people do that pollutes their minds, but I can start naming that and other things. But the truth is, what if we were just honest with ourselves and said, because sometimes it may not be something that like that. It might just be polluting our minds with negativity. Do you know there's a lot of negative stuff floating around? If you read an article that has if it's an opinion-related article at all, have you ever gone down to the responses? There's a lot of hateful people in our life, in our world, guys. A lot of hateful people. And I pretty much refuse to do it because it's just emotional ranting and raving that people give. And if I'm not careful, then I want to get caught up and I would want to give my opinion and give my point of view. But I don't even know these people. I don't even know if they're who they say they are. And so it just seems like a waste of time, a waste of my mind, a waste of everything else. And so I'm not saying don't engage, but engage where you can make a difference. Don't waste your efforts. I would just challenge you, if there's some place that garbage is given access to your mind, it'd be a wonderful thing to reverse that, to make a decision to reverse it. Number 5, put into practice what I've already learned. See, this guy, King Belshazzar, lost everything because he failed to do this. Put into practice what I've already learned. Daniel said, King Belshazzar, even though you knew all that happened to your father Nebuchadnezzar, you didn't learn from his life, and you still refused to humble yourself before God who rules from heaven. What a terrible thing. To know all about the history of the Bible, know about how God works, how he does everything else, and just refuse to learn it. Refuse to put it into practice. The lesson here is, if you don't humbly learn from generations before you, you end up making the same mistakes. And that's not an original thought. It's something that you've heard many times, but here's what I want to ask you. The most important thing that you could do today would be to evaluate your life and ask yourself a couple of questions. And one of them is this: is there some lesson that I haven't learned from my past or from my life and from the Bible, from big, long ago history or recent history? Is there something I've learned that's causing me to keep going in a futile cycle, a cycle of futility? Somehow I seem to be stuck over here someplace. Why am I stuck? What lesson do I need to learn to break out of that pattern? The other is, have I made Jesus the king of my life? Have I made him the one that I answer to? And if you haven't, I know a lot of people say they have, but if you don't see any fruit of that in your life, you might want to consider whether or not he really is king. If you have any doubt about that, and I'm not trying to dislodge any faith from anyone, you may feel like you have done that, but you've not been acting like it.